Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to give a list of some adult fantasy works that I think are fitting for the upcoming fall season. Obviously not everybody lives in the northern hemisphere and thus not everybody is entering into fall, so if that's you, hopefully there's still something on this list that sounds appealing regardless of whether you're a seasonal mood reader or not. But jumping into the list of books, first up we have The Tainted Cup. There's a couple reasons I think this is fitting for fall. First off, the general idea of this story is it is a murder mystery set within a fantasy world. When I heard that synopsis, thought it was going to be light on the fantasy and a little more heavy on the murder mystery, especially because it was very much marketed as a Sherlock Holmes style of story. But in actuality, I was quite taken aback with just how prominent the world-building elements were, and specifically the way in which plant life is incorporated into near everything within their world. So you can have enhancements from plant properties, and the murder mystery itself is kind of centered around something that occurred with plant life, where a body is found with a tree that has sprouted from within it. So the plant life aspect of it is part of why I feel like this is really fitting for the fall, because for me, the thing that makes me love fall so much is the way in which it's so obvious that there's nature changing around you, and the plant life with changing colors of leaves, or just the leaves are all falling and they settle in everything and everywhere. There's just something about it where it just feels like nature is so much more present. So I think that that already ties in this season and this story, but also the murder mystery component, because there's something about being on the edge of your seat. It's not exactly scary, but there are elements to it that are alarming, and there's certainly this feeling of unease surrounding this murder mystery. Who caused it? What caused it? What's behind all of it? And I think The Tainted Cup has a good combination of all of these things. By the way, if you are interested in hearing about more creepy, and I would even go as far as to say witchy books, I'll have a video that is focused on that, and then I'm also going to have a third fall themed recommendations video that is cozy and fairy tale-esque. So no matter what you're looking for within the fall, hopefully there will be something that appeals to you within these lists of recommendations. Continuing on though with another adult fantasy, next up we have The Unmaking of June Farrow. I find this author, something about her writing just already feels very in tune with its surroundings. I think she grounds you within the settings, and it feels quite atmospheric. With this one in particular, you follow a woman who has been passed down throughout her family some kind of madness. At some point, the women in her family, they start to lose their sense of reality, and our main character knows that that is happening to her currently. She's trying to keep it a secret from everybody around her because she's relatively young and she doesn't want everybody to worry. She doesn't want everybody to treat her differently, but it's getting worse and worse, and it's getting more difficult for her to tell what's real and what is part of her imagination until something really monumental occurs where suddenly everything around her changes. It feels as though she's in a different time, but people are talking to her like they know her, and she doesn't quite know what to make of all this, so she's trying to protect herself while trying to also understand what's even transpiring. So once again, there's a little bit of a mystery component to this one. If you don't know, I recommend books even if they didn't work for me, and this is one where it wasn't something that necessarily ended up gripping me in the long run. It didn't really sit with me, but I know a lot of people absolutely adore this author's writing. Again, I think this writing is really fitting for this season, and I do think that there's a lot to this story that is going to keep a lot of readers really, really invested. Next up, we have The Justice of Kings. I don't know that I would say that this first book in particular is the most fitting for fall. The second book, though, absolutely starts to lean into some horror territory. Just the implications, which I kind of feel I can't say because I don't want to spoil, but the implications are already so terrifying that they themselves, I think, are all that you need for this to be fitting of the fall season. Let's just say, to keep things vague, that it has to do with necromancy and sort of seeing into the other side past death, and what you end up seeing on that is far more terrifying than you could have imagined. The next one I have on this list purely because I just think there's something about the fall and the winter that makes me feel very nostalgic. I know for a lot of people, they have certain traditions that they carry out this time of year. They meet up with family. It reminds them of when they were a kid. They have hot cocoa and sweets and certain foods that bring out all these memories from their childhood. So I'm tapping into the nostalgia factor, and that would be for the book Ascendant. This is not obviously an older work. I'm assuming most people did not read this as children because it is a newer fantasy series. But it is sort of that classic A Boy and His Dragon tale that I think it's going to bring something new that you likely haven't picked up before, but it also has that sense of familiar, and specifically that sense of familiar that probably taps into something from your childhood. I know a lot of people picked up Aragon when they were young, or they picked up some kind of dragon story in their childhood, so I think this is going to relate to that really, really well. There is an additional element within the world building that also I think is fitting for the season, which would be the scourge that is taking place within their world. So the dragon riders fight back against this force that is primarily made up of these bug-like creatures that wreak havoc. And even if they don't necessarily kill somebody, they can still cause death by having it sort of settle into a person. And if they are too far gone, there's no chance of them recovering, which that in and of itself is horrifying to imagine, but also bugs are disgusting. And I think anything that's disgusting, any creepy crawly type of thing is fitting for this season as well. Kind of more almost of a Halloween feel to it. Next up, we have Starling House. This one, to me, in my mind, is always similar in certain ways to the Unmaking of June Farrow. Not because the premise is similar, but there's just something about the way the authors crafted their stories that they remind me of one another. So I do find that if you like one, there's maybe a chance that you'll like the other. This one, though, follows a young woman who ends up working for this man who is actually the inheritor of this strange and mysterious house. I do want to be clear that when I heard about this story, I thought, especially given the name being Starling House, that this was going to be a little bit more of a haunted house type of story, but I don't think the house plays as big of a role as far as in the ways we usually think of horror-leaning creepy houses. I think it's more so that it sort of serves as a vehicle for the ways in which stories change, because how our main character thinks about the house versus how the man she's working for thinks about the house versus how people throughout the town think of the house, it all changes. And a big thing in the story is how reputations and the view of a person can change and can be warped and shifted depending on who is telling the tale. And whoever has the power often gets to tell the tale that is remembered, and what that can do to a person who is harmed. So it does have some really serious themes within it. It also has kind of a small town feel, which I think is also somewhat related to a lot of the books you see that people pick up within the fall. But I do think the house, even though it's not necessarily a haunted house type of story, I still think that there are enough factors to this magical, mysterious house for it to work if you are somebody that likes those types of stories. Next up, we have the Fireborn Blade. This is another dragon fantasy, and the reason I'm including it for the fall is because I very much felt like this had horror leanings as well. The idea is you are following this woman who is determined to gain back her good reputation, and she wants to have some of her status restored to her. She was formerly a knight, but then something happened, and so now she's trying to get that claim to what she deserves once again. And in order to try and prove herself, she decides she is going to go deep within the lair of this one dragon and obtain this sword from its hoard. When you go into these dragon layers, however, there are these strange psychological things that can occur. There are also the ghosts left behind from the people that the dragons have killed in the past. And if those individuals' ghosts end up touching you, they can go into you, and then you will relive their final moments. It can plague you for the rest of your life. There are all these really strange things that can occur. So I actually think rather than saying it's horror fantasy, maybe it's more like it's psychological horror fantasy, and I loved that component of this. I thought it was so interesting. It's not absolutely the scariest thing you're ever going to pick up. But I do think there were enough elements to it that when you sat back with it, you're like, I feel disoriented and uncomfortable, and I can't imagine, that seems terrifying. And the author really had a way of planting you within certain scenes and making you feel like something was right there. And also, why is our head fuzzy? The character's head's fuzzy. I feel like my head's fuzzy. I thought the author captured all of that phenomenally. Next up, we have a newer release, and that would be The Bright Sword. I hesitated to put this on the list because I don't know if I necessarily think of King Arthur when I think of fall stories. Maybe for some of you, you do, because some of those classic works, I find that this time of year is when people like to do rereads. So if you are somebody who typically rereads a lot of your favorites, including things like Once Upon a Future King or Lord of the Rings, then maybe this could be kind of what I described with Ascendant, where it's something new but feels familiar. However, the reason I actually decided to include this here is because pretty much any kind of fae or angel or demonic being that you could think of, it is all just poured into this story, and it feels like a who's who of mythological people. And I really kind of enjoyed that about this story. I have a hard time categorizing what I think is going to work about this book because there's just so much to it, and I think it's more so a book that facilitates a lot of discussion, as there are so many different themes throughout this. But if you like all these different kinds of creatures and beings, and that's something that you gravitate toward in your fall reads, this one's definitely going to have it. And then last for today, we have, I'm cheating, it's not actually an adult fantasy book series, but there is a manga. I'm currently watching the anime, and that would be Attack on Titan. Attack on Titan is horrifying and super violent, and it seems terrifying and very on edge. And in some ways, I actually feel like there's some parallels between the world building in the Tainted Cup and in Attack on Titan. So it's kind of a nice full circle bookend, nice way to complete this list. But Attack on Titan, there are people, the last remaining human beings, who are trying to survive within the walls of this particular area. It is pretty much the only people left on the planet as far as you know, and there are these giant beings known as Titans who, if they manage to break through, or if you try to leave this walled city, they will eat you and they will rip you apart. And it's so unrelenting. It's just constant fear, not knowing how to fight back against these things, just trying to run, but they find you and they destroy everything. And the second you think you're escaping, they're there, and it's really edge of your seat. If you haven't checked out Attack on Titan, it is very, very violent. Also, the sub is better. I'm not normally that person, but the sub is better than the dub if you want to check out the anime. But anyway, I think it's great. I'm loving it so far. So come love it with me. But anyway, that's it for a list of some adult fantasy works for the upcoming fall season. As I said, I will have a couple of other fall-themed recommendations videos. We'll have Creepy and Witchy and Cute and Fairy Tale. And then also, I've done these sorts of recommendations videos in past years, so I'll have those linked as well in case you'd like to get more recommendations. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.